Hey Mike, I've been interacting with you on X for a while, and we've talked about things back and forth. And something that you mentioned to me that really stood out was that you're proudly not in the military anymore. You
Yeah.
talk a lot about Bitcoin, you talk a lot about the military. I feel like there's some connections that you've made there. Let's get started. Why is that?
So I'll try and keep this brief. And for just so you know, Rajat, and then for your audience, I'm not known for being brief. A lot of my writing is very long form, and a lot of my ranting is also long form. So I apologize preemptively. But
No worries.
one of the reasons why I'm proudly not in the U.S. military is for those that have kind of had their head in the sand or just haven't had the opportunity to pay attention because you and I both understand the fiat hamster wheel, and a lot of people just don't have the time or the energy to be able to pay attention to everything. The U.S. military is not what it was. It's not what it was even like 10 years ago, let alone 20 or 30 years ago when I was born. And kind of like spending 6 years in the Army National Guard, specifically Army Aviation. I got like my first peek at how the Army is not what it was, or the U.S. military is not what it was, or what it was sold as, was right up front in basic training. Basic training was an absolute joke. I'm not sugarcoating it when I say that I went into basic training the best shape of my life, and I left in worse condition than when I went in. Um,
Wow.
it's so easy. It's so easy. The biggest part is like the mental, and like once you like about 3 weeks in, you should be able to grasp what's going on in basic training, and it's then you're poking fun with the drill sergeants and just trying to find a way to get messed up. But then the big one was when I deployed for about a year to Kuwait, and I learned some of the games that the U.S. military was playing, particularly with land ownership throughout the world. The example would be the base that I was at was supposed to be a 24-hour base, but it was basically perpetual. It was a forever base essentially. Like we had just strategically plopped one of a number of bases in Kuwait right on top of oil land that we had that we know for sure there's a massive basin of oil down there, and just it sounds a little far fetched, but once you understand like the relationship the U.S. military with like Standard Oil and the CIA with Allen Dulles, like they played a lot of those games in the 30s and the 40s coming out of World War II. Um,
Can you explain those relationships as well? Just I don't want to interrupt you, but I feel like
yeah,
those are things that my audience may not understand. I personally probably don't even understand them,
yeah,
so maybe you can explain those as well. But
I
yeah,
will happily, man. These are all rabbit holes
amazing,
that I love going down. So like for
amazing.
example, my favorite one that I've been researching lately, thanks to my working with Colonel Towner Watkins on Twitter, talking about Operation Gladio, was CIA Director Alan Dulles had worked with Standard Oil back in the 30s to essentially trick the president of Indonesia into allowing Standard Oil to have the rights to a massive copper deposit that they had found. But reading a book by Greg Poulgrain, which is The Incubus of Intervention, Greg Poulgrain had detailed how Alan Dulles and others knew that the deposit that they sold to the president of Indonesia was not about copper. There was actually about 15 times the amount of gold that was actually reported there, because apparently I've learned through this book and like doing a little bit of research that copper and gold and nickel tend to go together, like when they're deposited in the ground. And what they reported in within this report, which I believe was sent to the Dutch first, and the language barrier they utilized purposely to kind of muddy the waters of how much gold was actually there. So like the primary example was that, so like when Americans refer to grams, the acronym is G, right? But then when the Dutch refer to grams, the acronym is GR. And then when Americans refer to grains, the acronym is GR, and the Dutch use G. So
Mm.
the concept was that when these guys reported the amount of gold in this copper deposit, they flipped them. And if you're in that
Oh,
industry, you don't like accidentally flip those around. Like especially if you're Dutch or you're American and you work with the Dutch regularly, which Standard Oil did. Like, you don't accidentally flip these. And it gets to the point of suggesting that it was even more intentional with how much gold has actually been siphoned out of that site. So at the time, it was the largest gold deposit discovered in history, and right now it still sits at number 3 in the world. And the belief is that they have siphoned a couple hundred tons worth of gold out of that area because they mix it in with the slurry, which is kind of like a liquefied mixture of like these different metals and alloys and everything. So that's just an example of like the kinds of games that like the CIA and the intelligence community with the military will play in order to get like resources siphoned out in very kind of like illegal or behind or below board or under the table kind of like relationships. And Colonel Towner Watkins has detailed this relationship or these strategies being deployed in over 37 countries. So like
Wow.
getting like a peek behind the veil is just like, okay, I don't like that our military is being used in this like kind of format. They're getting used in this format of where we develop or establish bases in other countries to establish democracy or defend democracy throughout the world. And then we use these services like the CIA and Alan Dulles relationship with Standard Oil to siphon things out illegally, or because you're a Bitcoiner, Rajat, I'm going to assume that you've also read Confessions of an Economic Hitman.
I've heard of it. I haven't read it
Okay,
though.
that's another book that I would definitely recommend. That's going to be far more interesting to read than the Greg Poulgrain book that I just quoted from. Um, but Confessions of an Economic Hitman is another kind of stand or strategy like pinpoint where John Perkins discusses how he was part of a a infrastructure development kind of program to where him and his firm would go in and they would sell these development projects. Say they're promising to build up a power plant and the infrastructure required to distribute power reliably throughout the country. They would make these plans, they would wrap them up, they would manipulate the statistics to make it very desirable for the host country to take up this project. And the idea would be that we're selling them on US debt in order to do it. We do that, they
Wow.
take on the US debt in order to get this development project, then we intentionally come through and sabotage that project so that they are essentially indentured servants to the US into perpetuity. And
And this is done intentionally.
what's that?
And this is done intentionally.
Yes. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And
So do you?
go ahead.
Oh no, I was gonna say, do you think all of this is just a result of information asymmetry? Like, is it just one group has all the information while the other one doesn't quite understand what they're getting themselves into?
I certainly think that's part of it. But I think that's really just kind of I think that's a tool in the toolbox, essentially.
Mm.
I think the primary driver behind it is I guess would be kind of an extension of what you just said, was that because they don't understand the tooling of the US dollar and of the fiat currency and of the Federal Reserve, that they also don't understand that it's a massive way for the US to gain power and to keep those, I mean, allies or friends nearest them, they keeping them essentially as cash cows to be bled dry. I don't think
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people like, I mean, I certainly wasn't aware 7 years ago of all of these like kind of like dastardly schemes and strategies and everything. And then like the unfortunate thing is that as Bitcoiners, we kind of see these strategies, and then we tend to be some of the early people to Bitcoin, to understanding it versus the rest of the world, because we're pattern recognizers, right? And once you see the patterns, then you start to kind of like judge it against everything else, and you're like, wait a minute, like this, like I'm seeing this everywhere else. Like, if this is the case, if it's true that we're doing this so many other places, like it gets pretty disgusting and pretty disenfranchising pretty quick,
Yeah. It almost feels like that's what the fiat currency system is designed for.
right? Yeah, I would agree. Because I mean, a great parallel would be the food. Like, look at
Yeah.
what's going on with the food, and I'm of the personal position that a lot of these problems stem from the fiat currency system.
Bitcoin is generational wealth, and to secure it, you need to make sure that you take self custody. Most of you still haven't taken self custody, and you're taking a serious amount of risk by leaving your Bitcoin on an exchange. Don't be one of those people who lost all of their Bitcoin by leaving it on an exchange that went bankrupt. Instead, reach out to the cybersecurity experts at The Bitcoin Way. Their patient and thorough one on one training teaches you how to self custody your Bitcoin properly, how to run your own Bitcoin node and protect your privacy, and how to set up de-Googled privacy phones to make sure that nobody is spying on you. They can even help you explore Plan B residency programs to maximize your family's options. So when you're ready to go down the right rabbit holes, schedule a free consultation at www.thebitcoinway.com/Rajat. The best investment you can make is buying Bitcoin. The second best investment is securing it properly. Make sure that you don't delay because your generational wealth and self sovereignty are at stake. Go to www.thebitcoinway.com/Rajat to schedule a free consult today. Yeah. They're started from the fiat currency system. Like, let's say, for example, so actually, can you give us your explanation on how fiat breaks our food?
Yeah, I would love to. And a lot of the stuff I'm going to go down here is going to be thanks to my working with Texas Slim a couple years ago on some articles for Bitcoin Magazine. So thanks to Texas Slim and then a number of other individuals that he connected me to for the writing, for the research that I had to do, I've learned that so I also went to college for exercise science. So I have a little bit of experience or expertise in health, very surface level. When we're talking bachelor's degree, I've learned personally that a lot of the information that I learned in my bachelor's degree, you can get on YouTube for free for like 10 hours worth of just watching a video. So just take anything I say with a grain of salt. Like, I'm not trying to prop myself up as some sort of prophet or something. But the crazy thing is that we have, so in America, for example, we have a population that is weighed down by a slew of chronic metabolic syndromes and diseases. So we have like 40% of the population, I believe, is either diabetic or pre-diabetic. We have, I believe, anywhere from 10 to 20% of the population is taking SSRIs daily, which are sustained serotonin reuptake inhibitors. For those that don't know what that is, it's the antidepressant medication.
Wow.
And then we have a major percentage or a meaningful percentage of the population also taking some form of ADD medication. And then you just go down from all the different health conditions from there, and and that's not even touching on how much of the population is obese. I believe it's 40 to 50% of the population is also obese. And a lot of these individuals are also taking a number of those medications together. So they could be diabetic, taking SSRIs, and taking ADD medication all at the same time. And what that means is that you have a population that is all those amount to dollars, to liabilities on a monthly basis. Like, you have to be paying for that, whether it's the person paying out of pocket or it's their health insurance provider. Those are all costs that have to be paid by somebody. And a lot of these problems we're finding out are due to inflammatory responses by the body. So one thing that I thought was really interesting was diabetes. Type 2 diabetes, and even I think maybe even type 1 diabetes, is starting to consider to be an autoimmune disorder because it's the body attacking the insulin, essentially, or the pancreas. And then you look at the ADD stuff, and it's, I don't know if I would necessarily say autoimmune. I'd probably be speaking out of pocket there, but there's a lot of information that's suggesting that there's like inflammation early on in child development, or even in development within the mother's womb, that causes the development of autism or ADD like symptoms. And like, again, a lot of this is seeming to come from the diet, whether it's environmental, like it's pollutants within the water, or the environment in general, or it's specifically diet, the food that you're getting from the store versus food that, which is like, if you're getting food from the store that's hyper processed, that's a problem that's causing a lot of inflammation. But one thing that I see that is not talked very often is you get food from the store, and a lot of times it's sourced from outside of your home country. The
Mm.
prime example being beef here in the US. Thanks to Texas Slim, I learned that most of the beef that we're buying at these grocery stores is not, even if it says it's it was like produced or harvested in America, doesn't mean that it was raised in and grown and treated in America. The majority of the beef that we're eating that we get from the store that's packaged is coming from countries like Brazil. And then they
Mm.
bring it to the US for the last couple of weeks of its life, and then they process it. Then they put it on the shelves after they wrap it in plastic. And then there's also the I read the book Countdown by Dr. Shanna Swan, where she talks about endocrine disrupting chemicals that are messing with like testosterone levels, which is super important because a lot of these endocrine disrupting chemicals are specifically weakening testosterone levels in both men and women, which negatively impacts, for example, sex drive by both men and women. And it's particularly important for men because it affects a lot of our, male development and natural male things like being driven towards competition and striving for achievement and all that other stuff. Now, where it really gets into, and I warned you, I was long winded. So, where it really gets into the health stuff, and where we're talking about kind of like the tide of Bitcoin and how fiat really kind of destroys health, I was just strictly talking about like the kind of surface level first order effects of things. Where things get really unfortunate is that if you're going to look at the health and talk, or if you're going to look at the health and talk about how food is the problem, then you also have to look at the food. And the food, we're finding out, according to the work by Dave Montgomery and Gabe Brown, they have found that the nutrient density of the produce that we're eating today is about 1/8 the density that it was back in the 40s.
Wow.
So that means that what that translates to, as for those that aren't good at fractions, that translates to about, like, if you're eating like a clementine or an apple or like an orange that was actually made in the US today, you're getting, even though it's probably a number of times larger than the fruit that they could have gotten back in the 40s, it has about 12.5% the amount of nutrients that fruit would have had back in the 40s. And that is meaningful because if you're only getting that much fruit, like just think about like an apple a day keeps the doctor away. If that was true back
Now
in
you
the
need 8 apples.
Yeah, if that was true back in the 40s, you better eat 7 more apples today in order to keep that doctor away. So, and then like if you want to try and figure out why our food is so nutrient, I don't even know what the opposite of dense would be. Why, if you're trying to figure out why our food isn't as dense as it was back in the 40s, you have to look at the soil, right? Because if like that's where the plants are growing from. That's where the trees are growing from, the vines, like whatever the fruit the watermelons, like whatever you're trying to like look at, you have to look of where like it's making birth from, and that's the soil.
Mhm.
And the reason why the soil is so nutrient light or nutrient undense is that we have companies like Monsanto, and I believe it's just now Bayer, that have been pushing these fertilizers for these farmers in order to be able to keep up their yields. And it's not just
Wow.
fertilizers, it's herbicides, it's pesticides, it's all these different chemicals that are based off of materials that were first used to make bombs. Um, the high nitrate materials in order to help like stimulate the growing factors within the soil. But the problem is that we're not putting them in a natural format. Like we aren't building these farms in a natural kind of way so that they support themselves and they re-up these nutrient factors into the soil. So like what we're doing is we're artificially saturating them with these fertilizers and these herbicides and these pesticides to try and get the yields that we want. But right off the bat, like 50% of this stuff washes out into the water table. So
Yeah.
you're already wasting money there. And then you have like the strategies of all these farmers that like this industrialized monocropping, which is for those that don't know what that means, the industrialized monocropping is what they're doing out here in my home state, like in Iowa, where you just have fields full of just corn or
Mhm.
soybeans or whatever. Like it's just that's industrialized monocropping. You have just millions of these plants all together in one giant area, and then you go out with the tillers and the combines and just collect it all up. Versus something like regenerative agriculture, where you build these farms in a way of where they have a bush row and a hedge row to be able to facilitate growing like plants and animals that all like they'll be able to house like falcons and hawks and different birds that are going to eat the different pests off the plants, and then there's the predatory birds that are going to eat the animals that are eating the pests off the crops, and it manages itself. And then you also have like
Yeah.
strategies for managing the crops and everything to make sure the nutrients are getting put back in the soil properly. That's all being motivated and pushed by this fiat dollar system, because back in the 70s, there was a massive strike by farmers. It was thanks to Earl Butz trying to push. He had a quote of saying, the farmers are either going to go big or you can go home," which meant that they were going to play ball by the industrialized monocropping industry, which is Monsanto and Bayer, or you're not going to be a small family farmer anymore and you can no longer survive. And there was a huge problem with farmers committing suicide back then, because they were being driven out of their family business, just because like the state decided they were going to start subsidizing corn. And so like,
S-
go ahead.
So I was gonna say, so the military part is about um, information asymmetry, where
Yep.
one group has more information than the other, and they can use it to their advantage, and they can basically steal resources from other people.
Yep. Yep.
This one, so with the food, it's more about making as much profit as you can.
Yes.
And even with the fruit, for example, like what you're saying, the fruit's bigger, but it has less nutrient density. So you're buying more fruit, you're paying more in terms of weight, but you're getting back less. So what they're doing is it's like the fiat currency. Like we're paying them with fiat currency. They're getting money that's being devalued. So they're giving us food that's been devalued,
Yep.
right?
Exactly. Yes. And they're forcing like a high volume of they're essentially forcing a high volume of transactions through that. Because even
Yeah.
though
So
even though
how
the
would
food's
Bitcoin?
bigger and it like you might
Yeah.
get full off of it because of the
Yeah.
volume you're putting in your stomach, you're going to need to buy more in order to get the nutrient benefit.
So how do you think Bitcoin would fix? I know the answer.
Yeah.
How do you think Bitcoin would fix both of these issues?
Good question. So like let's start with the farming first, because that's top of mind for everybody right now. The first thing that I can think of is the work that Texas Slim is doing right now, where he's been going not only across the country, the U.S., but he's going to like internationally for the last couple of years, meeting with ranchers and farmers over in Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia. I believe he went to as well, and just going around and like kind of like spreading some education with these farmers and these ranchers and individuals to get them to understand some of the economics of like what we're talking about. Because and I've been talking with as many individuals as I can at work here in Iowa, of just like average Americans, because average Americans right now are the ones like the middle class and lower that they they don't know what to do because they see the economics in their bank account, but they don't understand it. And the biggest thing is just like kind of like getting people to understand. It's like, look, I don't care if it's $5, $50, $500, or $5,000 that you're putting away in year in Bitcoin. I want you to start doing it now so that you can start benefiting even marginally a little bit from it before it starts to really kind of like leave us all behind. And the big thing is that because Bitcoin is scarce, because there's only going to be ever 21 million. I mean, technically, we know that there's not even going to be 21 million. It's going to be just shy of that. But because there's a fixed supply, because you can't, what I like to call spiteful ownership, because you can't have it removed if you are securing and holding Bitcoin properly, right? Like the spiteful ownership aspect for me is super important, in the sense of if you possess your seed phrase and you protect it properly, nobody can remove that from your ownership. Like, and you can take that to your grave. There is not a single thing in human existence that's ever been like that, ever. And there probably
Mhm.
won't won't be into the future, in my opinion. Like if Bitcoin is done right, and excuse me, I had coffee, it's making me burp.
No
Um,
worries.
if we did this right, and if we protect it properly, then there probably won't be anything like this in the future. There's going to be things that are built on top of it. Um, when you have that kind of, like, just the combination of those two aspects, you can't remove it from my ownership if I don't want to give it over to you, and it's perfectly finite. That is massive when you have the backdrop of something, a fiat currency like the US dollar or any other fiat currency that's existed for the last couple thousand years. And what makes it super important for the average individual to understand is that means that the Bitcoin is going to be stationary. It's going to be like locked in place. But then you have the flood of fiat currencies on the other side. Bitcoin's just going to be floating on top of it. That's all it's
Mm,
going to be doing, right? Like, as far as the value goes. And there's which is kind of like counterintuitive now that I think about it, using that example. Like, you wouldn't think, like, because it's anchored, you wouldn't think that it would float on top of the ocean of fiat currencies and dollars that are out there. But I mean, you look at the Turkish lira, that's precisely what it's doing, right? Because, like, all that money printing, for those that aren't well versed in, like, the kind of like money lingo, all of that money printing translates to dollar liquidity. That liquidity has to go somewhere. And there's a reason why you see the government and the central banking cartels, like, working to make all these different funding mechanisms, like the BTFP program.
yeah.
They're operating as overflow buckets for all this excess liquidity to go somewhere. Because if it doesn't go somewhere, it's going to seek out where the best place it is for it to sit and make birth, right? It's going to find the safe harbor in the middle of the storm. And that's what we're seeing right now. Like, that's what we're seeing in markets at the current moment, is that the liquidity is looking for the best place to make birth. And a lot of it's finding place in Bitcoin. And I think a lot of it's going to find more safety in the Bitcoin harbor. And it's very important for the average individual across the planet, whether you're American or not, to understand that concept is that, the what is it, Gresham's law? Money flows to
Yeah.
where it's best treated. And
I think so.
Bitcoin is like the best. That's where it's treating money and time and energy the best. So, like, I would recommend starting to accumulate some of that real estate before the rest of the world starts to find out. And doing so, to get to your question, and doing so, the more of these farmers, the more of these ranchers start to understand this concept and start saving even just a couple dollars worth a month in Bitcoin, that couple dollars worth is going to turn into, like, a couple, like you're starting to add a digit on the front. Like, a couple dollars a month can turn into tens of dollars a month, can turn into hundreds of dollars a month. And then all of a sudden, like we don't know what that can do. Like, even just like the psychological relief that can provide, as having a safety mechanism of, like, okay, I don't want to have to spend this, but I have this treasure trove of Bitcoin behind me that I can use if, say, my daughter were to happen upon an unplanned or unexpected medical, like, emergency or something like that.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes sense. And it gives you that freedom to just make better decisions,
Yeah.
make better long-term decisions for yourself, for your family. Instead of being forced to spend your money right away, you can spend it whenever you have a better opportunity to spend it.
Yep. Yeah. And, like, and a lot of people that I can understand the whole not believing that until
Yeah.
you actually get there, because I didn't believe it before. I didn't believe that having a couple months worth of funds in an emergency kind of like account, just for the sake of having it for a safety kind of like fallback plan. I didn't believe that could actually have any sort of meaningful effect on my mind or my psyche until you get there. And then you kind of just don't necessarily forget it, but you have the capacity to kind of just, forget about it. I guess forget about it would be the right way, because then you can go back and just, like, oh yeah, I have that. That's it's like finding out that you have a firearm that you forgot about in a tight moment, or Or like, for example, something that maybe everybody can like relate to is like you forget about like that little treasure trove of food that you had in the closet at the moment where you're like super hungry, and you're like,
Yeah.
oh, this okay, I feel safe now. Like I'm not panicking because I'm so hungry, right? Like that's in. I recommend that everybody that's listening, that if you haven't done it to the point of where you get like the emergency fund, set up the emergency fund, just do it, and then wait a couple months. You're gonna feel a lot better for doing it.
Yeah, just having that just having that available for whenever you need it, it makes such a massive difference. Even for entrepreneurs. Let's say, for example, if there's a shop near my house, um, and they accumulate Bitcoin, Tahini's.
Oh,
I'm sure you've heard of them,
yeah,
right?
yep,
They've been accumulating Bitcoin for a while. A lot of other shops in the area are going down, like restaurants.
yep,
They're going bankrupt, but they've been just going strong. And I feel like, again, if we tie this into the farmers, what it does is it gives them the ability to keep creating real value, keep creating real food, not see that their inputs are increasing in price, and then um, they can keep their social contract with their customers alive.
yes. And yeah, exactly. And to that point, they don't have to. They won't be. It decreases the likelihood of them being pushed into a corner of where they have to violate that social contract by um, weakening their product quality in order to
Yeah,
actually make ends meet. And that's the big thing, right? Because and one thing that I like to talk about is we're here in the US, we're a fully plastic economy. Durable goods are not what's in. All these companies are like making these plastic products and these plastic services in order to capitalize on the use, abuse, and replace kind of like economy mechanism. And that's not something that you want. Like you want to, if you're going to spend hard earned cash or whatever currency you're using, Bitcoin, if you're going to spend that, you want to spend it on a product or a service that you know you can rely on, and that you know you're going to get your dollars worth or your Bitcoin's worth out of for much longer than you had intended to.
yeah,
Like look
yeah,
at all the TVs and stuff that are out there. Like TVs are cheap
yeah,
now because like so many of them got made that nobody cares.
yeah. Yeah, I guess that also helps you with abundance as well, right? With if the producers are wealthy and they actually enjoy what they're doing, they're gonna create better products.
Yeah.
They're going to create more products, and it's going to give you higher quality products instead of having less dense food. We're probably going to get more
Yep.
nutritionally dense food,
Yeah, I mean, like
right?
just think back to I don't know any time you've had in the last couple of years with work or back when you were in college. When did you have better ideas? When you were under pressure, or when you had the freedom to think creatively without the pressure of like the making the deadline? I come up with better ideas to when I have the freedom to just kind of like relax.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's why these podcasts are so great because it just gets you to think, right?
Yeah,
It gets you to think. There's no pressure to think that, oh, this is what we need to be talking about. You can just talk about whatever you want, and I feel like that helps. I feel like that could apply to farmers. That could apply to entrepreneurs. If you have the savings, you don't have to be thinking about, oh, which S&P 500 fund should I buy, or which piece of land should I buy in the next 6 months? Because if I don't buy it, then my money is going to lose 12% of its value. You don't have to do that.
yeah, that's big.
It just changes everything.
Yeah, that's
Okay.
and like one of the things that I like also like to talk about, like that touches everything. That touches every corner of the economy, every corner of the U.S. country, every corner of the globe. Is like that relationship with Bitcoin touches on every single industry. It touches on the medical
Yeah.
industry. It touches on energy, which is like oil, gas, nuclear, the theoretical physics type stuff, which I've been digging into personally with like nuclear fusion and all that. It touches on the military. It touches on tech innovation with like you can be talking about computers or like weapons or whatever. Like that mindset and that benefit of having the treasure trove behind you to protect you, it touches on all of it, like all of the innovation, because just the last 10, 15 years, I know that we've all been touched by the lack of innovation. Like we're on the iPhone 16 and it does all the same stuff that the first iPhone did. Like What are we doing? Like what? Like
Yeah.
why don't we have smartphones that can project holograms yet?
I don't even think it's about that. I think it's more about just directing your resources towards the wrong things. Right? Like instead of having an iPhone 16 that does exactly the same thing as an iPhone 3GS, you could be making machines that help you produce food a little bit more easily,
Yeah, yeah, you're not wrong.
right?
And like that kind of touches on some of the stuff that I've seen with the potential for combines that are like using little like light laser technology to sterilize the crops as they're going over it. Like that should be ubiquitous by now, I think.
Wait, so how would that? So what they would do is instead of using pesticides, they would do something like this, like
Yeah.
using those machines.
Yep.
Oh wow, okay, that's actually really interesting, and it probably stops the all the chemicals from entering the food. It stops the quality from decreasing
Yep.
because all these chemicals are just changing how the food tastes,
Yep. And it also
right? Oh wow,
it's also it's changing what has to be dumped into the soil so that
yeah,
so you don't have to drop fertilizers to get those nitrates put back in. You can continue to just let like the last year's crop just kind of die into the soil and all that.
yeah,
And then it reduces the amount of water that the farmers have to dump onto the crops in order to be able to facilitate that mycorrhizal environment underneath the surface of the soil, which is the bacteria kind of like ecosystem that's underneath the surface within the root system, because you need those bacteria to actually break down the minerals like the phosphorus and everything that's in the soil, and then gets turned into sugar and other different nutrients that get taken up through the roots.
yeah. Wow. I feel like the rabbit hole just keeps going
Yeah.
deeper and deeper. What about the other side of things, the military?
So that's a big one for me in the sense in our me and my co-host over at Bitcoin Veterans is that one of the biggest things biggest issues with military service is that a lot of times the individuals that enlist, they do so because they don't see any other way out. And then so there's a problem economically, but like that's not really a problem that you're going to get away with. There's always going to be members of society that they're in a bad spot and they need a place out. So like the military tends to be a good way to go. But one of the big problems is that the military is not adequately compensated for like the risks and everything that they have to take. So a lot of the soldiers that even when I was in service, was it 20, so like 6 years ago is when my contract ended. And one of the problems is that the majority of the army is run by the ranks from private to specialist, and the amount of money that the military was paying them as a salary was not enough for them to even make ends meet while living on a base. So if your soldiers are not being compensated adequately, they're going to make that compensation up somewhere else, right? Like, because
Yeah.
like that's the human thing. Like you're a problem solver. If you're a human, you're a problem solver, and if you have that particular problem, you have to find ways to make money elsewhere. The U.S. military does not like that, so that's why back in like 2017, um, back then, the U.S. military was stating that owning Bitcoin was illegal for soldiers. Like you couldn't do it.
Wow.
Um, and you're gonna get to the point of where your soldiers are like anything like that is gonna be deemed as like, well, I don't really care because you guys aren't paying me enough to be able to actually do this job or to even like live a relatively meaningful or stable life. So then you get into problems with, so like when we were deploying, there was a unit that kept getting in trouble for doing very illegal activities like production of drugs, which was meth. They were making mobile meth labs.
Wow.
And they were also running prostitution rings where their female leadership was actually prostituting out their soldiers. And so you get into these issues where like the US military, because of the economics, it's eating itself. Like the system that the US dollar is based upon it, right? Like everyone says like, well, what's the US dollar backed by? It's backed by the US military. But if the US military is doing these kinds of activities, then it's just like, okay, that doesn't really sound like the backing is very reliable, because they're going to be going out and doing these activities. So the big thing is that beyond that, the U.S. military also tends to be a calling, right? Kind of like being a police officer. We can wrap all the servicemen and women up together. We can talk about the U.S. military, the police officers, the firefighters, the EMS, like the EMTs. We can wrap all of them up together in the sense of you want most the people that feel the calling to these services. You want them there. Like, you have to have them there in order for these services to be done properly. This also, and I'm going to also wrap in like nurses and doctors,
Yeah.
because doctors don't make what we all think or what we all thought that they made. Like, they are so laden by debt that they're effectively no different than the private and the military or the nurse that they're working alongside with. You want those people there. The dollar system that they're based off of for compensation is not serving them at all. So they need something else that's going to be able to provide them the economics to get a better life the following year. Like, you need people to be able to experience their life getting better each year. Like, if they're making
Yeah.
the right decisions, if they're doing the right things, if they're working their butt off, you need them to be able to improve their standing every following year. Being able to save in something like Bitcoin that is separate from the investing world, because Bitcoin is different from the entire investing world, because once you everything inside the legacy like investing system is effectively the same thing, just repackaged as something else. And
Yeah.
if that system is failing, which it is, if you when you have the relationship with the soldiers having to make ends meet elsewhere, that system's failing. You want to put your hard-earned time into something that is outside that system as a kind of safety proxy. So this would be like we were talking about, like the emergency fund. This would be the emergency fund to your emergency fund, right? Which is also why when we're talking about Bitcoin, we don't go around spouting some irresponsibility like you need to put every single dollar you ever have into this, because that's not responsible. The
No.
responsible action is to get the emergency fund first, and then anything that's left over that you can afford to lose, you put into the emergency fund of the emergency fund, right?
Mm.
Because that is completely separate from the rest of the system. So the thinking would be that if all hell breaks loose, if rapture comes upon us and like the Ragnarok is here and all this stuff is happening, then the hope would be that the emergency fund to the emergency fund will be able to protect you in some form or fashion. That's the
Yeah.
thinking. And
It
when
almost
you have something outside the system, it just increases the likelihood of that being there.
it almost feels like all these other assets were created as a distraction to keep people away from gold.
Yeah.
Or like we started thinking of them that way, because if you think about it, how high would the price of gold be if all of the dollars were going directly into gold? So let's say, for example, the reason why I say it this way is because price is determined at the margin. So if all of the wealth is just concentrated into gold, instead of people buying houses, instead of people buying stocks, instead of people buying bonds and everything else, they just buy gold because gold is money.
Mm-hmm.
What would happen to the price of gold? It would probably go to like $100,000 an ounce.
Think of what would happen to the price of electronics if it went up
Yeah,
that high. You wouldn't be
yeah,
able to have electronics for anything.
yeah. Or you'd look for inferior replacements,
Yeah.
right? Because that's the only way to go. I mean, electronics producers are going to continue wanting to produce electronics.
Yep.
I don't even know if there's a replacement for gold in electronics. I don't think there is.
No.
But again, I mean, that goes back to Bitcoin. Why are we using gold as money when gold is valuable in these other things? So the way that I see it, with Bitcoin, you basically separate money from everything else.
Yeah.
You separate money from gold, you separate money from real estate. Today people are using real estate as money.
Which it should not be at
Right.
all.
And that's so if you separate money from everything with this thing that's digital, and it completely separates the legacy financial system from whatever assets you have, How much Bitcoin do you think somebody needs to retire?
Oh, back to
I just dropped that question on you. I feel like that was just. I feel like you didn't expect it at all. But what are your thoughts
no,
on that?
no, dude. I love this stuff coming from angles that I'm not really kind of like looking because I had the chuckle because this is what brought us to even like having this podcast to begin with
Yeah,
was our little back and forth on
exactly.
Twitter. I honestly think that having an individual now, especially so I'm a millennial. I think a millennial that has a million sats right now, 1% of a Bitcoin, I think by the time we get to retiring, I think that you'll be able to retire off of that. Very seriously.
By 65.
Yeah. I very seriously, if a millennial, I bet if you were to put a million sats into a wallet, never touch it for the next 50 years, or I guess it'd be 40 years. I'm a little bit of a betting man, but I would bet that you could meaningfully retire off of that, like by the time we get there. Because like if you like just looking, and the one of the biggest reasons isn't like the dollar, like the dollar score that Bitcoin has right now. That's not really what I'm thinking. It's because that by the time that Bitcoin got to where it is today, I expected a lot more of the population, both in the US and globally, to kind of like be on the Bitcoin train. We're still at maybe 1% penetration. We still have
Yeah.
99% of the world to get to the point of like, just like, we still have 99% of the world to get to the point of just seeing that Bitcoin's not a scam before they even get meaningfully invested into it. Like
Yeah.
that's a long way to go. And that's not even touching on people's understanding of what Bitcoin is doing for the energy world right now, which is one of my favorite rabbit holes to go down. Like if you're new to Bitcoin, like the finance and economics and the philosophy stuff is awesome. Don't get me wrong, but like you really want to have your noodle racked a little bit. You go into the energy side and you understand what Bitcoin mining is doing for the energy grid and energy producers, and then you will understand why like America's energy infrastructure in particular has not progressed anywhere in the last 40 to 50 years.
Do you have time to go into that?
Yeah, I got time to go into
Yeah.
that.
Okay. Let's do it. I feel like that. I want to learn from you. I feel like this is a very interesting topic. This is something that I haven't spent too much time thinking about. So, if you can maybe just consolidate some of this information, and I feel like I could take away a lot. So,
Yeah.
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so I'll talk about the two big ones, which would be oil and gas and nuclear. So let's start with oil and gas first. One of the big things that's going on right now is that we're kind of watching the flailing of the wind and solar industries against their renewable energy selling point that they've been using to the rest of the world, which is them just utilizing the fiat subsidy system in order to make a bunch of money off of government guaranteed money is basically what they're doing. The problem is that renewables, as far as wind and solar, they produce power outside of what is called the peak demand window. The peak power demand window is like mid to late afternoon and into the evening when everybody in the country is getting off work, is getting done with school, is coming home. What's the first thing you do when you come home?
TV.
TV. You turn on the TV, you start doing the laundry, maybe you swap over the laundry from the washer to the dryer, and then you refill the washer. So you got both those things going. You start preparing to make dinner. So the oven's coming on, you're opening the fridge, you're doing all this other stuff, you're maybe powering on the computer, you may be charging your phone, and you've got if we're using the US as example, we've got 350 million Americans doing that in a wave across the US as time progresses across the different time zones. That's the peak demand window. Wind and solar do not produce their peak power production within that demand window. They produce just outside of it, either earlier in the afternoon where the sun's at its peak, or at its highest locus, which is noon, or like right now being winter, is not really producing peak anyway because it's so low on the horizon. And then wind tends to produce both early morning and late into the evening, because that's where you have the major changes between the sun heating the surface of the earth. And like when you heat the surface of the earth, you warm the air, and the warming of the air causes the differences in the different in the temperatures of the air according to where it is located in proximity to the ground. So warmer air rises, colder air sinks. When you have the sun coming through in the morning and into the evening, you're heating the ground, you're producing pressure differentials. Pressure differentials flow from high to low. That produces wind. So like
Oh, wow.
when you have the sun that rises in the morning in the winter, it's a lot easier to notice is when the wind starts to pick up. So then as you're going into the evening, the wind starts to die down, and during the winter it tends to get a little bit warmer. That doesn't really matter for our conversation. I just like to mention that. But so you have these different differentials going on. So wind will produce in like a little bit more in the mornings into the evening, and then solar will produce primarily in the middle of the day. And then you have most people demanding power early to mid afternoon, early to mid evening, and then later on into the night, and they kind of like pedals off around midnight. Now, oil and gas is particularly important to this conversation because natural gas is the primary energy source that's relied upon to kind of like cover down the where wind and solar fail at. So the way that they do that is with peaker plants. Peaker plants are called peaker plants because they come in when demand for power peaks, and there is like they need somebody to bridge the gap if we're falling short. Peaker plants tend to run very expensive because they are paid to remain idle, because you can afford to remain idle.
Oh,
They'll only consume like 20% of the natural gas stores that they have, so they can effectively keep the equipment warm or ready to be spooled up whenever they want. But that's only one side of the natural gas. That's peaker plants specifically. Otherwise, there are natural gas plants that do provide power consistently and reliably just through natural gas alone. They're obviously going to be cheaper. They're not the same. They're not the same as peaker plants. They're just power plant provider, and they're reliable and they're good. And so then you also have coal, which coal is providing power similar to the natural gas plants, not quite peaker plants. I think there were a couple of those before, but you don't produce power as quickly and rapidly as a natural gas peaker plant does. So those are the main ones. And then you obviously have oil, which you don't use for power. You use for producing products. Like basically everything that we're using right now to do this podcast is downstream of oil. Plastics, metals, everything that is in the wiring from the rubber coating down to the wire itself is thanks to oil. And then let's touch on nuclear real quick, and then I'll start like kind of wrapping everything back in together. Nuclear has been particularly what would be the word? They've been, I would say, violated for the last 40, 50, 60 years, because there's been some pretty intense public campaigns to demonize nuclear because of events like Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and Fukushima, where a lot of people think that there's going to be a meltdown from a nuclear power plant if there's one near them. B, they think that if there's going to be a nuclear meltdown, it's going to be something like Chernobyl, where it just completely destroyed the environment immediately around the plant, and everybody around it had to evacuate, and they can't go back for a while. So first, I want to state that the Chernobyl situation was not due to a failing in nuclear power plant design. That was a failing in human operation, because what they decided to do, for those that don't know, effectively what the Russian plant operators decided to do is that they were going to do something that they have never done before, where I forget the exact mechanism, but they effectively turned off like a cooling fan system that they should not have turned off. And
I think I saw this on that docu. Did you see that show that
I
they
haven't.
on
I
HBO?
have not watched the show yet.
I think I remember this only from the show. I don't remember the details, but yeah, I remember what you're talking
Yeah,
about. Yeah, yeah.
they had shut off a cooling system, and that caused it to effectively go into overdrive or overheat, and then it caused the meltdown. Um, so I want to state first of all that I know a little bit about the nuclear stuff because my dad was a pipe fitter when I was growing up, and he's particularly specialized on nuclear power plant like operations, and
Mm,
he would be off for nuclear power plant shutdowns for like 6 to 9 months at a time. He has some really cool stuff, like stories that he's told me
mhm.
about just like being able to be inside and see a nuclear reactor power up and like hear like if you've seen the videos, like the kind of boom from like the blue light getting turned on. I'm
Yeah.
very envious of being able to see that and experience it. But anyway, reactors nowadays, like I think Chernobyl was probably a Mark 1 or a Mark 2 considering how old it was. But getting into like Mark 3 and Mark 4 reactors, if you Google like a Mark 3 or a Mark 4 nuclear reactor, their systems that they have set up now that are standard, you could have a meltdown on one of these Mark 3 or Mark 4 reactors. And with the amount of cement and kind of like insulation that they have on these sites, along with the automation that help run these sites, you could be working on a nuclear reactor that experiences a meltdown and you will not get irradiated. Like
Oh wow.
that's massive as far as like the containment that they have, the work that they've done to make sure that the containment is responsible and reliable. And I mean that's a big one in my opinion because so many people are so afraid of being close to a nuclear reactor. It's like if you're close to a nuclear reactor, your concerns are they're bigger than having to deal with a meltdown. Like you have to deal with like people at that point. Like you're talking about different threat vectors to that end. And then
Yeah.
the interesting thing too is like going down like the nuclear rabbit hole. People that look up, like I would recommend looking up like thorium reactors. Thorium is a material that is far more prevalent throughout the world than uranium is. So it would be far cheaper to be able to produce reliable energy, and that's kind of the big thing to nuclear, like why it should be more prevalent and why we should get to the point of looking at thorium reactors and everything is that these kinds of like these kinds of materials or these kinds of strategies for producing energy, you like the intensity is one thing, but reliability is really the bigger thing, right? Because like when you're going to maintaining when you're talking about maintaining or developing a society, it's not really being able to have access to large amounts of power that helps society develop. It's having the reliability of power, because you could have an infinite amount of power, but if you're trying to like do R&D on a product, like for research, or if you're trying to like build something, and you can have like if you had access to infinite power but you don't know when that power is going to cut out or when it's going to come back, what are you going to do? You can't really do anything because you can't plan for
No.
anything around that. So the biggest thing is reliability of power, and nuclear is like the perfect provider of reliable power. Like you look at if you pull up the ERCOT dashboard, you can actually see down in Texas they publicly share the power provisioning within the state on the ERCOT grid of like how much is nuclear, how much is coming from wind, natural gas, solar. And you look at the nuclear line, which is in yellow, and it's just flat. So yeah, keep going down. Keep going down. Oh, I can't remember where it's at. Keep going. Yeah, go back up. Go back up.
That's the lowest it goes.
Yeah, go back up a little bit.
Oh, here.
Fuel mix. Yeah. So oh, they changed the way they do it. That's why. So they used to have a graph like the one to the right, which is the energy storage resources, but they used to have it shown as a graph, and I don't understand why they don't anymore. But
Oh.
nuclear would be a nice flat. There you go.
Oh, here.
Nuclear is a nice flat line at the bottom. You see how much all the other providers deviate, right? But
Yeah.
nuclear is just nice and flat. That's what you want for developing in a society. Because one of the other, like on top of reliability, when we're talking about expanding the infrastructure for power provisioning for a society or for a civilization, you have to expand in kind of like a step function, right? So as the overall demand for power for a local like civilization um develops, it's kind of like a nice little halfway straight curve up and to the right, right? Because your population grows, it's just more power, and then as more technology comes out that uses more power, the demand for power continues to increase. Is kind of like a positive feedback loop.
Yeah.
Now, when you're building out the infrastructure for provisioning power to a locality, you're not going to like you're not really going to be just constantly expanding like you are. But when it comes to building projects and everything, because of like seasons, you're going to do like kind of spurts of growth, right? Like during the summer, you're going to expand the infrastructure as much as you can that's going to maintain the economics. So you're going to build out the power
Mhm.
lines, you're going to build out the power plants, you're going to build out the substations when it's warm, when you're not dealing with, ice accumulation and the difficulties that snow and ice bring with like the logistics of transporting materials and labor and everything else. You're going to do it when it's the most reliable and most trustworthy. That causes a step function to where you're going to grow during the summer and then you're going to kind of flatten out. But then when you look at like the more mesocycle, like the bigger picture type stuff, you're also going to see that there are years where you grow rapidly, and then there are years where you kind of like stay flat. Then the population is growing with that nice little smooth curve
Oh yeah.
underneath, right? Because
It's like the hash rate and the price for Bitcoin.
exactly, yeah. And there, because like there's also going to be like the innovations in technology and everything, like innovations in the ASIC miners to where they're going to become more efficient. And like these miners they're not going to be having mass turnover of miners every single year. Like they're going to push some of these models to their limit, and then in a couple of years they're going to they're going to replace the oldest miners with some of the newest, and you're going to get more of that step function reality to where it's like, okay, the S9s are out, the S20s are in, and then the S20s are going to be in, and then after a while they're going to be replaced with whatever like the next model of miners are, like the M37s or whatever, and then they're going to get replaced, and then that's just how society works, right? Same with everybody kind of getting the next new phone or the next new laptop or whatever. And so it's important to understand that, because you want a reliable power source again to be able to facilitate that kind of relationship. And the big thing is that Bitcoin really pushes that relationship to its most efficient. Bitcoin mining pushes that relationship to its most efficient means, because when you have like the step function in innovation and infrastructure expansion, you also want something that can smoothen out the power demand curve. So I
Mhm.
apologize for that, but if you go back to that ERCOT dashboard, um,
Yeah.
what Bitcoin mining allows is that dip that you guys all saw go, yeah. So like, yes, so those different deviations, and then if you go down to system wide demand for me,
Yeah.
yep, and then you click on the well, no, we can just leave it right there actually. So that system wide demand, where you can see it deviating from like 50,000 was that millivolts or milliwatts? Yeah, it's milliwatts. I don't know why it'd be millivolts. So it's you have the swings from 50,000 essentially to 65,000. If you have demand like that, that like every major swing is, yes, that's perfect. All those different kind of like peaks and troughs is going to be putting different demands on the system, right? But then if you have Bitcoin mining, and I wrote about this in a paper that I wrote about the solo model of just like return on demand for like infrastructure and companies and everything. Think of Bitcoin mining as filling the gap. So like we have the high peak of around just shy of 65,000 milliwatts, 62,000. Perfect. Thank you. If you have Bitcoin mining in this space, you can effectively keep that demand at 65,000 consistently and let the Bitcoin miners fill in the negative space between, right? Because
Mhm.
when we've already seen it in Texas and then over in Georgia with Clean Spark, you have these Bitcoin miners that want to come in, and then the localities are like, okay, yeah, come in, have the demand for power, pay for your power fairly. But then when demand starts to spike and we need that power for the rest of the citizens and the rest of the businesses in the area, we need you guys to curtail your demand so that we can distribute those electrons where they're needed. And sometimes you have the relationship of where people thought that like Riot and Marathon were getting paid to turn off. That came out to be like halfway true, but it's really they were utilizing derivatives to allow themselves to basically get paid for turning off. But anyway, they
Oh,
have strategies to make money where they're curtailing their demand. But some of these areas are also giving them credits for the power grid to turn off. It's like, okay, if you do turn off when society demands, we will reimburse you for turning off by giving you credits for paying for power. And so, like I think it was 2023, Riot had a big one where they turned off in a moment of massive demand, and they got so many credits to where they effectively got the rest of their year or an entire year of power's demand paid for because
wow.
the grid needed it so much. So that's probably my favorite thing with Bitcoin mining is being able to fill and standardize and stabilize the power demand so that you have this massive gap, because like that differential, that what would you call it, that delta of what could be getting made by the power providers to the point of where they're able to make that money. Then you got the power providers, you're looking at them, they can innovate, they can hire, they can expand, they can upgrade, and they can maintain better because they have more funds flowing to them.
Yeah.
And then you have that peak demand to where it's like they can do all those steps, those 5 steps, to the point of where they could even expand. Because of the Bitcoin miners, they have a justification to build out their power provisioning infrastructure, their power producing infrastructure well beyond what society's demand is. Then you're talking about getting to a point of where brownouts and blackouts literally become a thing of the past. And that is
Yeah.
massive for anybody here in the United States or anybody globally, especially like the developing areas like Africa, where gridless and as Eric Hansen are working in particular. Like if you have these developing countries like out there to the point of where they can avoid blackouts and brownouts before, like well before they get to the point of being a second or first world country. Like you're talking about massive major improvements for expansion and development, and they will be able to leapfrog what the US is capable of doing. And like you're like you'll probably see African cities or countries get to the point of actually looking like Wakanda before the US does.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. I feel like it gives so just to connect everything that you're saying here. Basically, Bitcoin makes energy more efficient.
Yep.
It makes it so that the military doesn't have um it doesn't have an information asymmetry, I guess.
Yes and no.
And
Because the military is going to have its information asymmetry, but
right, right, right.
different areas. Yeah.
But then the military, the people that are working in the military, if they're paid in Bitcoin, then they no longer have to do side hustles and side gigs to get to pay
Yes.
their lifestyle expenses.
Yeah. And
So
they
that's the second thing.
and just like the military, excuse me, all the other servicemen and women, they can continue to focus their time and effort into their, excuse me, into their passions. That's the big one.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest one. Like you want the calling professions to remain a calling and not be forced into desperation.
Yeah. So that's the second one. The third one is our food is going to be more nutrient dense,
Yeah. Yep.
right? Okay. The fourth one is Bitcoin allows everything that you talked about there with the power grid, the energy. Bitcoin allows us to do research and development into making energy more widely available.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
And
Wow.
not just more widely available, but more potent too. Because
More potent.
when you have again like that consistent reliability, like we were talking, you can do R&D more. more reliably.
Yeah.
And because of that
Wow.
relationship of where um, the energy is more reliable, energy also becomes cheaper when it's more reliable, because then the energy provider can also play around in the world of forwards and futures, because
Oh,
they
right.
can forward sell that power to a company that wants to build an R&D facility on their grid. They can forward sell that power to them for a little bit of a discount, but they can get that cash now, and then they can use that elsewhere.
Wow. I feel like it just changes so many different things. Even for this conversation, I think I'm gonna have to listen to this like 3 times to really get everything that you're saying. I feel like there were points there where I didn't quite understand what you were saying, but then if I do the research, if even the people listening to this, if they do the research on the side and they just try to go a little deeper, they're gonna grab so many pieces of information and there's so many gems that are extremely valuable. Um, I have one question that I want to ask you. I ask all my guests on
Okay.
here. The question is, what do you think is the most important downstream effect of Bitcoin? I know you mentioned, I guess, four in this video already. You can mention any of those ones, but then you can also say something different if you like.
I like I like to say that the energy is the most important, but I'm honestly going to say that like the most important effect is going to be what it does to the individual's psyche, as far as like being able, like having that kind of like emergency fund of like being able to protect the individual from failings in monetary and legislative policy. Um, because it's ultimately, whether it's in the military or medical or in food or even in power, it ultimately comes down to the people, and being able to protect the people and protect the people from both themselves and their governments. Um, I think that will allow for such radical improvements over the next 20 to 30 years that like and by the way, thank you for the compliment earlier when you were saying that you're gonna have to come back and listen and like kind of like grasp what I was talking about. Like I take that as a
Absorb it all,
compliment.
yeah.
Like that's I really appreciate that. But I think that even like the stuff that I've ranted about today with you, I think that there's a lot that's coming down the pike that I couldn't even fathom. Like
Yeah.
there's gonna be such rapid like, so I'll give you another rabbit hole that you and your audience can go down. This one's really really fun, especially if you're into like the kind of like the frou like UFO stuff. So one thing that I think is definitely coming, because of the benefits of Bitcoin being outside the system, and because people can kind of like go and research and look into things that like, not only that they will be able to get funding from anybody because you can't stop a Bitcoin transaction, right? But also because of individuals that are going to benefit from Bitcoin. Like, I don't know if you saw recently, but the Sam Hyde video that was put on Twitter,
No.
so Sam Hyde is a comedian, but he put out a video on Twitter like a week or two ago where he was kind of like poking at Elon, like, hey Elon, like stop doing some of this stuff. um he has benefited. He let slip in that video, he was like, I benefited from Bitcoin. I'm like, okay, so this is arguing my point, to where so many people are going to benefit from Bitcoin that they're going to be freed up to, because of the economic power that they accumulate, they're going to be freed up to kind of research and develop really whatever they want, almost like little mini Tony Starks, right? And I
Wow.
think what's going to come out of that is going to be massive innovations in areas that we couldn't have fathomed. And one of those is going to be looking at the energy production side. And I recommend as many people as they can look into the YouTube account Ashton Forbes. He's also on Twitter. He's been looking into some of the stuff around a flight that disappeared back in 2014, MH370. It was big back then, but because of what he's been researching for the past year and a half, he's kind of come across these the theoretical physics of like fringe energy generation around like cold fusion reactors and 0 point energy and all this stuff. I personally think that this stuff is real. And I think that, and he's been digging up a lot of evidence that is not only real, but the US government, Lockheed Martin, and Boeing and Raytheon have had access to these technologies for decades. That I think that a lot of this stuff is going to start finding its way out into the public sphere. And then people that benefit from things like Bitcoin that are in comfortable positions are going to be able to start trying some of this stuff out on their own. And I think that that's gonna, I mean, that's gonna be fueling what a project. This all gets into a project that I've been working on. I think that we are coming, like, we are in the early innings of the second renaissance, and I think that that's what all of this is kind of like accumulating to. Is Bitcoin is working as kind of like the vanguard of this penetration into the second renaissance, so then we can get the explosion of ideas and everything that are come about that
Mm.
have been kind of muted for the last century because of like the fiat US dollar system.
And the people's psyche actually fuels that.
Yes. Yeah, it's the people's psyche is kind of like is kind of like the flywheel itself, right? It's like
Yeah.
a positive feedback loop because you get the economic funding from Bitcoin, but the psychological benefits from having that funding and that safety mechanism of like, I don't have to worry about all of a sudden saying the wrong thing on Twitter or Facebook and then opening up my bank account and everything's gone.
Yeah.
Like that's a threat vector that like cannot be quantified in my opinion, because that's 24/7 fight or flight. Like you don't want to have to deal with feeling like you have to censor yourself on social media and then get punished with your bank account being frozen or whatever, like what happened with the trucker convoy in Canada.
Yeah, and you don't have to constantly be thinking about what you could do wrong.
Yeah.
And I mean, actually, what you're saying, you don't have to constantly be thinking about what you could do wrong to lose everything that you've always worked for your entire life. You've spent working for it, and actually, even if you don't do something wrong, you still lose everything that you work for in this life, which is just
Yep.
absolutely insane.
That's
Mike,
literally going through life in a minefield. Like you can't do that.
yeah, yeah, that's exactly it. Hey, Mike, that was a really great conversation. I don't want to go too long on this. I just wanted to say to you, thank you so much for your time. I wanted to give you just a little bit of an opportunity to maybe plug yourself.
Oh yeah, no, I dude, this conversation has been a lot of fun for me, man. I appreciate you even asking me to come on. I didn't like I did not expect that at all. And anytime you do want to chat about anything, all you have to do is send me a DM. I'm relatively easy to access to the people that I've already interacted with. So just shoot me a DM or an email or whatever, like anytime you want to chat, and I'll let you know when I can. Um
Amazing.
for anybody that wants to like kind of like follow along the things that I'm personally looking into, I have my own Substack. It's just hear me out. So if you do just hear me out.substack.com, you'll pull it up. Or if you can't, if for whatever reason, if it's failing there, I'm primarily on Twitter. I probably have a problem personally. I probably spend way too much time on Twitter. But my handle on Twitter is at the Mike Hobart. So it's THEE and then Mike MIKE and then Hobart HOBART. Um, you have to type the as you found out today.
Yeah.
I've been pretty heavily shadow banned for the last 4 years. So like the Elon system does a pretty good job of keeping me muted. So yeah, it's right there on the screen. And from there, I'll like you guys. I mean, I'll probably share opinions that not everybody likes, but sorry, I'm just sharing my opinion. And then if you guys are also interested, we have as I have in my yep, you just touched on it. As I have in my bio on Twitter, there's we have the Bitcoin Veterans podcast. We go live every Tuesday night. The time has been shifting the last couple of years that we've been live, just because we do have 4 co-hosts and we all have families and all of us have different schedules, and we like to try and have just more than one of us on the podcast. So like we've been shifting around a little bit. The time now is Tuesday nights at 9 p.m. Eastern. So that'd be 8 p.m. Central, and that would probably be what 6 p.m. Pacific, if I'm not mistaken. So if you guys want,
Mm.
like, by all means, join us there. I'm going to warn you, if you look up Bitcoin Veterans on YouTube, there's not a whole lot of activity. The things we talk about, like I've been shadow banned on Twitter. YouTube has been keeping us very, very muted for quite a long time. So like, and we do like a lot of the most of our activity comes from like live stream on directly onto Twitter. So if you guys like, I would love to see a lot of you guys over there. By all means, like chime in if there's if you're listening to Rajat and you're a veteran, we have a ton of group chats for veterans in the Bitcoin space. We have probably 30 or 40 different group chats, and there are thousands of different chats coming in every single day. Like I haven't been able to keep up with the amount of activity in our veterans chats since like 3 months in, and we're like over a year and a half in now. So it's awesome. I love seeing it. There's like tons of memes. We have it's a solid community, and we're growing like rapidly. So
Amazing.
yeah, I appreciate you bringing me on, Rajat. This has been a lot of fun, dude.
Absolutely. Everybody go follow Mike. I feel like he's dropped so much knowledge in this video. Like I said, I'm gonna have to I'm gonna have to listen to this a couple of times. I might have to speed it up, but there's so much information in this. There's so much information out there, like your podcast. Keep learning. I feel like that's the only thing that you can really do.
Yeah.
I thought I came into this conversation thinking that I'll probably know about a lot of the things that you're going to talk about, but I learned a lot. I learned about the energy grids. I learned about the military side of things. I learned about, actually, I didn't know about the nutrition density with food. So all that stuff. I mean, it just compounds and compounds. All the knowledge that you build, you're going to be able to use it to your advantage
Yeah.
in the coming years when we do go to a Bitcoin standard eventually, and I think we will.
Yeah, I agree. I think that there's going to be a massive kind of like power shift between Bitcoin
Yeah.
standard, and the dollar is going to be around for a while, but I think it's going to grow to the point of where the dollar is reliant upon Bitcoin.
Yeah, maybe we'll talk about that in our next
Yeah.
next conversation.
That'd be a great
Awesome.
one.
Thank you so much, Mike. Really appreciate your time here.
Thank you, Rajat.